Welcome, everyone, to Esoteric Easter, talk number 2. And I just love being here with you and delighted that you're here. Thanks for joining me. So this is now the narration of the perhaps the most dramatic story ever told, other than the story of the crucifixion and resurrection, is how Jesus went about getting into Jerusalem during the Passover, even though he was wanted by the Sanhedrin and marked for death, and all of Jewry had been mandated to, if they knew his whereabouts, to turn him in. So this is a dramatic situation. So we start from the camp at Pella, and this encampment north of Jerusalem, some distance, was a province where Jesus could work and teach without interference, and had thousands of followers came to this place, and his disciples and apostles ministered to them. It's a wonderful section. We're not covering that, but we covered last time in two talks, the incredible epical teaching that Jesus gives, is paper 170. And if you haven't heard 170, this talk number 1 in the Esoteric Easter series, please go back and listen to that talk. It's actually 2 talks in one, and kind of get reacquainted with that story, actually that teaching, which is essential background for what's happening now, because Jesus has made this final teaching to his closest followers, and we discover in papers 171, 172, and 3 that they misunderstood it drastically. They did not recognize the truth of the indwelling spirit. They didn't understand that. It was too alien to them. And of course, Jesus referred to that with the language of the time. They call it the kingdom of heaven within you. And we're told that really just a few of the close disciples and apostles got it, that it really was something inside you that was the core teaching of the gospel, which was the light of God within you, and that the entering into the kingdom was to enter into a relationship with the Father inside, rather than this outward notion of the outward kingdom of Israel being renewed by the Messiah, being inaugurated by the Messiah. And these followers were brought up in the idea that the Messiah was coming and it was imminent. So this was not really their fault. They were taught this at some with great fanfare, really, in the schools and the synagogues, that the Messiah would come. And so the belief and the lore of all of Israel was, he's coming now, anytime. So this Jesus, who's doing these incredible things, must be the Messiah who will enter into Jerusalem and create a new nation, as prophesied by the prophets. And they chose the materialistic interpretation of the prophecies, and they ignored the more spiritual interpretations that later they picked up on from Isaiah and others. Much later, it was understood that there was this notion of a spiritual kingdom. So let's get back to the story here, which is that, having been taught about this, there's an expectation of what Jesus is going to do. He's going to, leave Pella, and he's going to go south to Jerusalem for the Passover. And this may be the place where it's going to happen. This may be the time and the place where it will happen. He had gone in Jerusalem before and made very big pronouncements there. Also, they knew that there was, some very serious danger, but they thought Jesus could overcome anything. So, in fact, those who even believed that there was such a thing as an inner kingdom, that small minority, even they thought that Jesus was also, in addition, was going to become the Messiah of the people, for the nation. So there was a great confusion on the ground. Jesus, of course, knew this, and he was doing his best, to bring people around. And they slowly came around after his death. So this is the period when there's a very stark set of circumstances, which let's go over what they are. The followers are missing out on what the true teaching is, number one. Number two, the Jewish leaders are calculating how to get a hold of Jesus, apprehend him, put him on trial, and put him to death. This has been decreed. That's going on at the same time that Jesus is doing things that are, stark and dramatic as well. He's raising Lazarus from the dead. He's marching with this big entourage of about 1,000 people now who've left Pella, and they're moving through small towns in southern Perea on their way to Jerusalem. But Jesus is a strategist. He's a warrior, a spiritual warrior, and he's got it figured out how to engineer this so that he gets to Jerusalem in time for the Passover, when all of the crowds of thousands from around the Jewish world, all over the Mediterranean, when they would be there, so he could make a great statement, in fact, a final statement to his people. So there's this big elements, big factors all at work in this huge interplay. And then there's subplots. One of the subplots is the incredible great story of Lazarus, who had been not healed, but raised from the dead, just previous to this. And this was the greatest demonstration that anyone had seen. And in fact, it says nothing before or after it on earth has exceeded this miracle. So that's a subplot, because Lazarus is in Bethany, his hometown. Now the talk of all of Jewry is this man who had, by all accounts, been raised from the dead. Everybody accepted that had happened. It's just that the enemies of Jesus believed that what had happened is that by the power of the devil, that he had raised Lazarus. And so everybody knew that this was a supernatural event. And so in the subplot is, well, what's going to happen to Lazarus? And another subplot is the group of followers of John the Baptist, whose leader is Abner. And those who know this story, Abner, for those who don't know about the story of Abner was the leader of all of John's disciples, John the Baptist. And when they merged with Jesus's disciples and apostles at a certain point. And the Urantia Book narrates this very important story. And so this group is ministering separately by agreement, that they would teach the gospel, they would teach it, but they would be separate from Jesus and his apostles. They had a certain autonomy. They agreed to teach the teaching, and then the apostles agreed to baptize. They took on the rite of John the Baptist. So this is what had happened. And, Abner and his associates are at work in southern Perea, and Jesus and his entourage come across them in a town there. And this is Jesus' last meeting, last encounter with those folks. And he bids his goodbye to Abner. Now this is important, because Abner thereupon leaves and heads to Philadelphia, a major town in this province, and sets up his headquarters. And this becomes the headquarters for the most orthodox group of believers who really conform to the teaching of the kingdom of heaven as an inner reality. Abner really did get this. He's one of the very few. So he's a very prominent man and leader of this generation. And but he's kind of in a separate category because he's the head of John the Apostle's associates. But as part of the subplot, Lazarus is told by Jesus as he's passing through Bethany right after this that he needs to go and join Abner up in Philadelphia. He needs to flee out of this place because the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem had decreed his death as well, which was logical because you couldn't easily, very well get rid of Jesus without getting rid of the greatest sign of who Jesus really was, and that was Lazarus. So soon thereafter, Lazarus flees as well, and it's right after Jesus and his entourage come through that area. But just prior to coming to Bethany, where Lazarus was, they stop in Jericho in a very interesting scene there because there's this pretty large crowd, and there's a blind beggar who had heard about Jesus healing another blind beggar. If you'll recall from earlier part of the story, that was in Jerusalem that Jesus restored the sight of a beggar. This guy had heard about it, and I'll tell you about this because this story becomes prominent in Christianity, but especially in Eastern Christianity, because what happened is as Jesus was passing by, this blind man knew it, and he yelled out. He yelled out to Jesus at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, Lord, have mercy on me." And he several times loudly, and it was a little unseemly, but Jesus noticed his faith, and so he stopped this procession and bid the man come to him, and of course Jesus healed him on the spot. And why this is so important is it was just such a vivid story of how faith can open the door for Jesus to enter. And so the monastics in early Christianity seized on this story, among others. And they recited what this beggar recited. Jesus, have mercy on me. And that became their recitation. It was not like, a little bit like the rosary in Catholicism, in which you recite, it's not a mantra, but it's a reminder and a recitation. And one opens one's heart, and Jesus descends into the heart. And there's breathing with that. You're breathing into your heart as you're reciting, Jesus, have mercy on me. And this allows Christ's Spirit to descend into the heart. So we're talking about Esoteric Easter here. So I want you to know this is an esoteric practice of bringing the Holy Spirit into the heart. And it follows after Bartimaeus, who was this beggar, asking Jesus, have mercy on me. So check out that story. It's in paper 171. But in any case, the entourage, there's another stop that's worth talking about briefly, where Jesus teaches the core group about the nature of forgiveness. And what I've done is these important quotes and also a summary of all of these events I'm telling you. A written summary. I've written up a summary for you of these papers with the best quotes. And one of the better quotes is one that explains forgiveness, because along the way somebody asked about what is really the nature of forgiveness. And Jesus states that forgiveness is typically when there's a loving relationship. You don't have to make a separate procedure out of forgiveness if there's an issue, because forgiveness is something that just comes with love. it is included in love. Love is inclusive of forgiving the other. It's a given, and that's in a really loving relationship. That is the case, and it's especially the case in the relationship of God with you, because God has infinite love for you, and of course infinite knowledge, and you don't have to beseech the Father to forgive you. He's already forgiven. That's inherent in his nature, in the divine nature. I say his, it's beyond gender, of course. It's inherent in his nature to have already forgiven. You need to forgive yourself. So that's another part of the esoteric teaching, isn't it? But it's common sense as well. And we learned in the last lecture that the gospel more or less requires that if you feel wronged by others, that you need to forgive them in order to receive this forgiveness, which is always and already available to you. But if you're holding back and withholding from others that you may carry a grudge against or that sort of thing, that you need to let that go and forgive that person, and then get back into union. So anyway, that's one of the great teachings of this little period. But then now they've arrived at this point at Bethany. So Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem, and everybody's just a buzz about the situation. Jesus is now, by far, the talk of Israel. His fame is everywhere. He's done all these great miracles. He's still doing great miracles, and he's now in the hometown of where the greatest miracle took place, being Bethany. And they arrive at the home of Lazarus and his sisters Martha and Mary, and they're there for the night, actually at a neighbor's place named Simon, and everybody decides, or his hosts decide, to have a major banquet, and there's seemingly hundreds of people because the whole town is there, and this entourage is traveling with him. They're there, so this is really big banquet. So it must have been quite a festive occasion, because this is the town that really believes Jesus, because he had been there many times, even back to his youth, because he was distantly related to Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, and they were like his best friends. So everybody knew him, but then he had raised Lazarus from the dead. So, everybody pretty much accepted this, his divinity. So this was a celebration of his divinity. And really the mark of that is that Mary, in the famous scene, comes to Jesus with this cruse of spikenard, they call it. This is a container with this essential oil, I guess that is, and pours it on his feet during the banquet and wipes his feet with her hair, which I just think is such an endearing image of love and devotion. And no wonder this story has survived. Now there's another subplot taking place, and that's the relationship of Judas to things. And in this situation, this is kind of almost the last straw for Judas, because he's the treasurer, and he looks at this. He's got a kind of a narrow-minded view of things, which and he has not really grasped the teachings. But he's loyal. He sticks with it. But he's also a highly sensitive person who was a spoiled child growing up. And we're told a lot about the apostles here. But we learn that this is a major turning point for Judas. He stood up and said, how could she waste this precious ointment when we could have sold it and fed thousands of poor people? And Jesus rebukes him in front of everybody and says, you can always minister to the poor. And he really means it, because we always will, and we always should and can minister to the poor. So he says, that's just part of life, but you're not going to always have me with you. Now this rings loudly, because this is, a divine intervention that's, coming to its culmination. It's the greatest moment in the local creation, really, is the incarnation of Jesus as a humble human being. So, in the big picture, Judas is missing the boat. He's not the only one, but he takes great offense. So this sets him up for betraying Jesus later. Well, in any case, it's time for them to move on to Jerusalem. That night and at previous nights, Jesus sits with his core group and tells them what's going to happen. He tells them that he's going to be killed. He's not holding back because he wants to prepare them, emotionally for what's coming. And they don't get it. They don't believe him. It's not like they disbelieve him. It's that they can't fathom that this could happen. They think that he's immortal. They don't think he can be killed. And they also think he's going to declare his messiahship in Jerusalem. So they're thinking that he's talking figuratively, that he's going to rise on the third day. They thought that meant on the third day when they get in there, they're going to have some problems, and then he's going to declare the kingdom in power and glory. So they were missing a lot, but they were loyal and they loved him, and next morning they head into Jerusalem. So this is quite a scene. Now what had happened is some people had gone in advance, some of the disciples, to alert the city that the great prophet was coming. This was not calculated by Jesus. He was not a calculating planner, schemer of that sort. They let things happen almost naturally, although he was still strategic in his thinking. Anyway, as they were heading south into Jerusalem with quite a big entourage, a couple of thousand people come streaming out. And so this, of course, is Palm Sunday. Not Monday, it's Sunday, Palm Sunday. And they are meeting kind of in the middle. And this, of course, is the great festive occasion, which must have been a great treat for the onlookers, the invisible onlookers. And remember that, if you're new to the Urantia Book, it is important to know that people on other planets are watching. These are higher planets, higher worlds, but also advanced planets, because they have interplanetary TV, more or less. And this broadcast circuit is broadcasting live TV. This is really the most important thing happening in the local creation. So everybody's watching this, and it must have been a very beautiful scene. Jesus chose to ride on a donkey, and you can look that up in the Bible, and that's based on a prophecy. It's a very interesting notion that a conqueror, he's a conqueror of the inner life, and not arriving on a horse like he's a king conquered the city, but he's humble, and he's coming to his people who he loves, and he's a peacemaker. So this image is vivid, but again, the apostles miss the point of that, because when they get into the city, they're thinking that this is it. This is the big time, especially Peter, Apostle Peter, who's kind of a drama queen. So he's thinking that this is going to be the culmination of the ministry, that Jesus is going to announce, to thousands of pilgrims that he is the Messiah, and he's going to inaugurate, the Messiahship and take the throne of David and do great wonders. So what happens instead is they enter into the gate of Jerusalem, and Jesus dismounts and kind of just walks around and greets people, and they leave. So the Urantia Book is really good on this scene, because they go inside the heads of the apostles, all 12. Usually we're getting an exterior narration of events with a little bit of distance. But in this case, they go inside and into the interior life and feelings of the apostles, and you'll learn from that they're totally confounded by what Jesus has done. They think, because they're harboring this idea of the Messiah. So it's tragic and sad as well, but and poignant. But two of them did kind of get the idea, and that's John, who's more the spiritual disciple, and he's more right-brained in the sense that he understands the symbolism of riding on a donkey. He gets that, and so does Nathaniel, who's kind of my favorite. He's kind of the most intellectually adept and all-around good thinker who also gets this and even sees the humor of it, and he really grasps what's going on. The rest of them are really upset. They're crestfallen and befuddled. So they have an evening that's very unsettled. A number of things happen that evening, but what happens most importantly next is the entrance into Jerusalem on the following day, the Monday of this Passover week. And it's important to bear in mind that, Jesus is a wanted man. He could easily be arrested if he were alone or if he were off with a few of his followers. But what he's done strategically is made sure that he's with large groups of people who love him. And there's no way that the Jewish rulers are going to apprehend him in front of his, thousands of people. It's just not going to happen. So Jesus has engineered this situation craftily to arrive that morning so he can make his final statement, to his final teaching to the Jewish nation. And this is part of the mission, because the mission is the mission to the individual, but it's also secondarily a mission to the people, to the Jewish people who've been cultivated for centuries. And this is part of the epical revelation of Jesus, is to set this up and to have a people that will receive him. That's the Hebrews, and that's why the Torah and all of the things that happened with Moses all the way down through the prophets, the law and the prophets are the setup for this day, really. And of course, the more spiritual interpretation, the more esoteric interpretation of this is known to some, and they pick up on it. But to the big majority, they only understand the materialistic, outward, exoteric meaning of this whole thing. Not only that, they're being misled in that direction by the corrupt leadership of the Jewish nation, and these people are the ones who have decreed his death. So in this dramatic moment, is Jesus arriving early in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, with his people to teach. He mounts a platform in the temple precincts to teach. What happens? Well, from the Bible. Some of you went to Sunday school and had this drummed into you, that he is about to teach. And he decides instead first to overturn the tables of the money changers. Well, that's not exactly right. It's partially true. What actually happens, and this is one of the many amazing things that we get in the Urantia book, where they clarify these events that are very, pretty sketchy in the Bible and almost cartoonish in the Bible, and just give you a paragraph. And the Urantia book gives you pages, and they fill in the backstory. So it's a blessing to have these stories explained and given context that we moderns need. We're not going to go for mythic, these mythic, vague stories that are full of magic and miracle, and which are obscure. We want crystal clarity, and we get this here, which is what happens. Which is what does happen is that Jesus doesn't overturn the tables, but what he does do is in witnessing the noise and the raucous activity of commerce that's desecrating the sacred temple which everybody resented, and he did his whole life. But, and he didn't intend to, have a political statement, but he just couldn't even teach. It was so noisy. So he got one of these moments of dramatic action and grabbed the whip of a passing lad who was herding bulls through the precincts there into a pen. And so we get the story of that's what's happening. And Jesus takes the whip and whips these bulls, runs them out of the place, and then the people rise up. We're talking about thousands of people. They are the ones that overturn the tables of the money changers. In 5 minutes, this is accomplished. It's a done deal, and this is a cleansing that Jesus initiated. He was initiatory, but the people picked up on it because they too resented the obvious corruption and abuse disrepresented. So Jesus now has really seized the moment through this empowerment of his followers to take control of their temple and the sacred space of the nation, and it's breathtaking, I'm sure. So everybody is just riveted to him, through the day, and of course nobody's going to touch him, nobody's going to arrest him. So he's got this huge audience finally, and his statement to them is mainly, as I mentioned, a statement to the nation, which is, I am your I'm your savior. I'm your creator. It doesn't put it exactly like that, but I'm here as a representative of the Father to the nation for the salvation of all of you and of the whole world. And if you receive me, receive who I am and what I teach. But the parables that he teaches, 3 big parables, are about more about the nation's challenge to receive him, or else to get to suffer the consequences, which is inevitable, in that they did not carry out their appointed role. Which their appointed role was to be the people who would receive the Savior of mankind, of humankind, and to be a light to the whole world, not just for themselves. And this was their role, appointed role from the beginning, and it's there in the prophets. And he's illustrating that with parables. Now there are points when his enemies, who of course are present, try to ensnare him with questions, and he easily routs them. So that's the day, the great Monday in the temple. They return back to their camp, and there's another subplot, and that is the sudden appearance of Gentile Greek believers who come to the camp, and they're from far away places, from Athens, from Rome, Alexandria, and they're prominent Greeks, and there's quite a few of them. 30 of them had been baptized. So they have a meeting with Jesus, and it's a very interesting and important meeting. I failed to mention one of the key lessons of the Monday events and the cleaning of the temple. So let me back up and tell you that there's a special teaching in the Urantia Book by the writers, which is that in doing what Jesus did in cleansing the temple, this was his way of saying the following thing, which is, he does not look with approval on the refusal to use force to remove oppressive, vicious minorities. And that should be interpreted the way Martin Luther King and Gandhi interpreted it, is nonviolent resistance, loving resistance, even loving your enemies. But you must use the force moral force of your love to remove these evildoers from rulership and from oppressing the common people. And so I urge you to go back and look at that passage in paper 172. And it's also listed in the study sheet that is provided as well. So moving on. And I'm going to finish up. Don't want this to drag on too long, because the other thing is I'm just trying to inspire you to read this passage or skim through it and pick out scenes that you would like to see, because they're well marked. And just notice the starkness of this thing. This is, a drama and a kind of polarity, the likes of which it's hard to find any analog anywhere in history. And it's coming to a head. So the next day, Tuesday, they come once again. So Jesus is still able to rely on the protection of the group of his followers in the hundreds, thousands that are receiving him in the temple, and so he's safe. So what his enemies have done is they've been meeting through all of this, holding counsel, figuring out what they're going to do, and they tactically they decide on a tactic, which is to once again to bring right up to the stage, really, their most clever thinkers and leaders, the most articulate ones, to try to trap Jesus with mischievous questions. And so they try it again this day. And these stories are pretty much like in the Bible. And he just routs them. But, it gives you much more backstory than the Bible. And it just shows what's happening is, the divine mind of Jesus is in operation. He's able to anticipate what's happening. And the human Jesus is executing, what Jesus is needing to do. So these guys just shrink back in embarrassment in front of the people. And it infuriates them even more. The day ends with Jesus having taught the people, having routed his enemies, even to the point that he asked them a question, and they're too afraid to even answer the question. So they're completely stymied. So he's won a great victory for the last few days, and there are important points made that we can't cover. So we'll stop there, but I want to add a few reflections. First is that we have here in the narration many references to the biblical account, and I'm tracking through the Gospel of John. And I want you to know that, this is really fun for me because when, you fall in love with this story in the Urantia Book, so you're in love with the story. So you go back to the Bible, and it's also a lovely presentation, but it's very cryptic. But what I did notice this time, more than ever, that the Urantia Book is in relationship with the literal passages in the Bible. Many of them appear in the Urantia Book account, almost word for word, because they tell us that that's what they're doing. They're using these sources, and then they're embellishing human sources, and they're enhancing, and they're providing context to explain what really happened. And I just find it really fun and fascinating to see how very important statements in the Bible also appear in the Urantia Book, and then with much more backfilling the meaning of it and the context of it. So you can be assured that the story we're getting here is an enhancement for us in our modern and postmodern time. And this is again ultimately the story of the incarnation of our Creator and his use of symbols, tactics and strategies in order to get a message across, not just to those present, but to future generations and to other planets and to higher worlds who are watching, as to how much love he really has, and how the Father and the Son do embrace us in their love, so much so that they would send the Son of God into this situation that we've just examined. So we've covered paper 171 through 174. I'm not going to cover 175 because it really belongs with the next set of papers. So tune in next time, next week. I'm sorry this came late, but it's finally done. And enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you next time. God bless you all.